22, Fighting for the Four Freedoms. We're going to be covering World War II, ranging from 1941 to 1945. You might notice those are the years that the U.S. was involved, not the entirety of World War II. So the Four Freedoms are these famous paintings done by Norman Rockwell that cover what was meant to be near and dear to the American heart. So the first one you can see is, say, freedom of speech. So this is one of the four basics that people required in order to have a functioning society in the American mind. The second one is freedom from want, and this is suggesting that there should be plentiful food and happiness for people. The third is freedom of worship, which has been a long-standing freedom for the United States and the colonies before that. And of course, all of these things are more complicated, but the idea is that these, at their base, are things that people wanted. And the fourth one is freedom from fear. So this freedom from the idea that your entire life would be ripped away from you, or that someone may attack, or that you need to worry about the communist menace, or that you would need to worry about the World War engulfing the United States. So, beginning of this time frame, the four freedoms were what the nation believed was different about the Allies versus the Axis during the war. So the United States, being part of the Allies, was vilifying the Axis and saying that the freedoms that they held near and dear were not things that were held by any of the Axis countries. The war completely changed the landscape of this country and of the world. It physically changed the landscape of some places, but it socially changed the landscape and changed the borders of nations and changed the way that people thought about other human beings in general. This is one of those major turning points in U.S. history. And what also happened through this war is that it provided an end to the depression that had been dragging on, and an end to the unemployment that had been rampant throughout the nation during the Depression. There was a mass migration, so there was a large population shift into industrial cities, and there were more women than ever before as part of the workforce on the home front. There was no longer a sense of isolation that had been established before, after becoming involved in World War II, and there was no longer any denying that the United States was a major player on the world stage. So these are things, in general, very basic things that World War II means to U.S. history. So we'll start with the road to war in Asia. There are many people who will say that the war, World War II, started September 1st, 1939, and this is when Germany invaded Poland and Britain and France decided to join in the defense of Poland. And that may very well be a good marker for World War II in Europe, but World War II also took place in the Pacific theater, and Japan was making moves much like the German forces had been up until this point as well. So, trying to pinpoint the beginning of a war, certainly there are declarations of war, and that's oftentimes what people are talking about, but there are certainly actions that lead up to these declarations of war. And certainly there are things that happen afterwards, even after there are treaties signed that end the wars. Either way, in 1931, Japan, the Empire of Japan, was interested in expanding their empire, and moved their military into Chinese territory into Manchuria. And by 1937, Japan had moved further into China and was beginning to wreak havoc, including what is now commonly referred to as the Rape of Nanking. And sometimes you'll see Nanking spelled with a J also. It seems to be interchangeable. I haven't seen a really good reason as to why one would be, except for perhaps whichever language you're using to talk about it. In this Rape of Nanking, there were infamously, around 300,000 Chinese prisoners of war and civilians who were killed. And this is seen as one of the instigating actions for World War II in the Pacific Theater. And 1937 is a particular turning point for World War II in the Pacific Theater. So this is a couple years before the Eurocentric version of 1939. This is a map showing the aggression throughout Asia leading up to 1939, so leading up to the invasion of Poland in Europe. So you can see Japan and its colonies are in the darkest pink, and then there's the Japanese occupation in 1933, and the Japanese occupation by 1939. And it just means by 1939, not just in the year 1939, because we just talked about 1937. And you can see Japan was starting to spread out into mainland Asia. The road to war in Europe is probably what you're more familiar with, and Hitler rose to power in 1933, taking office in a landscape that was still really ruined from World War I. So physically, many places had not recovered, but economically and socially, there had been limited recovery. There was still an economic depression, and there was still this sense of embarrassment on the world stage for having lost World War I. And the Versailles Treaty, if you remember, had stated that Germany needed to pay reparations for the war. So any money that they did have was going towards these reparations for the rest of Europe. The expansion of the German Empire began to really take hold in 1936 when Hitler occupied the Rhineland, which is between Germany and France. And at the same time as this German expansion was moving forward, Italian expansion and fascism also began to spread. And Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, so you have invasions going on in Europe and North Africa. In 1938, what's called the Anschluss took place, and this is where Austria was invaded and occupied by Germany. All of this was alarming to FDR, and he was concerned about world domination, which was Hitler's stated goal. He was not concerned enough to accept Jewish refugees in a meaningful number, even after hearing rumors of concentration camps and the like. And he actually was part of sending a few hundred back to Europe, many of whom met their deaths, on this ship called the St. Louis, which had initially docked with refugees in Cuba and was rejected from Cuba and came to the United States seeking asylum, only to be turned around and sent back to Europe. I've included a short documentary here that you can watch about the St. Louis. It's one of the more infamous stories of this time frame, especially if you pursue any Holocaust studies courses, you'll start to see this story come up. So this is a map showing much like the Japanese map that we showed before, this is showing the German march throughout Europe. So you have Germany, and the Rhineland, which we talked about, and you have the areas annexed in different years. And by 1939, you would have, by the September of 1939, you would have movement into Poland as well. So 1938, Britain and France had been relatively overcome with Hitler's moves across Europe. They were not as well prepared as they thought they may have been. And the Soviet Union attempted to stop Germany from expanding any further in 1939, but that didn't come to be. And in September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and this is the storied beginning of World War II because Britain and France jumped in to defend Poland as they had agreed to do previously. Paris was overrun in June of 1940, and the Germans eventually installed their own government there, this sort of puppet government called the Vichy government, to run France. And from 1940 to 1941, England sustained major bombings, most famously in London, but in other cities as well. And this little red blob that you see over here to the left is actually the number of bombings that took place. This is a map of England, and these are the concentrated bombings around London. The United States was hoping to remain neutral for World War II. And they had actually passed several neutrality acts in 1935, seeing the storm brewing in Europe and the Pacific. And they'd promised not to intervene and not to sell arms to countries at war. By 1940, there was a little bit of a different tune, and the United States was willing to sell arms to Britain in what they called a cash and carry program. So this is where Britain would pay cash for arms and then transport the arms on their own ships. So the United States was not bringing them to them, and they were not giving them a loan. They were not just handing them over, but they were selling them, which had been in contrast to the Neutrality Acts a few years before. The United States also continued to help Britain and China with supplies moving forward throughout the war. There were many people who did not want to enter the war, having seen the results of World War I not so far in the past. FDR won a third term in office, which was unprecedented at that point, and would be unprecedented now because there's a 2-term limit. But in 1940, he won a third term and moved forward with this kind of back and forth support for those against Hitler's expansion and against Japanese expansion. Pearl Harbor, you've likely heard about every year in school in December. The U.S. government had frozen Japanese assets within the United States, and oil was their main connection to the United States. And so this froze their oil income. And Japan needed that not only for their own functionality, but also for their war effort that they were waging against China. By the end of November of 1941, it was clear that Japan was going to stage an attack in the Pacific. It was unclear when or where exactly, so it wasn't the case that they knew that it would be Pearl Harbor and let it happen. It was unclear exactly where or when it would take place, but they knew that something may be imminent. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was destroyed, this naval base. And it was the first foreign attack on U.S. soil since the War of 1812 when the British invaded. Obviously, there were attacks on U.S. soil during the Civil War, and some people may argue that the Confederate States of America was a separate country. But for these purposes, what they generally mean is a foreign country, not one that had recently separated. And in this bombing at Pearl Harbor, about 2,000 soldiers died, and 187 aircraft, 18 ships, including some battleships, were destroyed or damaged. Following this, the U.S. declared war on Japan after Congress voted 477 to 1. Jeannette Rankin was the only dissenter. We talked about her before. She was a pacifist, and she had not voted for entrance into World War I either. And she stayed true to her feelings and her belief system and voted no, but she was the only one to do so. I have included a short clip of FDR's actual declaration of war against Japan for you to listen to. The Pacific theater of the war was, it had many elements that the European theater did not have. It had a race element that wasn't particularly present in the European theater, and it was easier to other the Japanese defense, the Japanese soldiers, because they looked different. They had a different language entirely. They weren't oftentimes people. They didn't resemble people that the American soldiers knew at home, because there was a limited Asian immigration system in the United States. So when the American soldiers fought in the European theater, they oftentimes knew German people at home, or they knew Italian people at home, or they knew French people at home. They were more familiar with those nationalities than they were with Asian nationalities, and it made it much easier for people to jump to racist conclusions. In response to losing U.S. oil, access to U.S. oil, Japan had taken Burma, which is now Myanmar, Siam, which is now Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. And they all had oil reserves that would be particularly useful for the war effort and for Japanese functionality in general. The Japanese armed forces caused the surrender of 78,000 U.S. soldiers in Bataan in the Philippines, and this is the largest surrender in U.S. history. So it was clear that the Japanese were going to be able fighters, that this would not be a quick thing for either side. The battle in Midway led to Guadalcanal, which is a notoriously brutal set of battles, and other battles that eventually led to a larger U.S. presence in the region. But it was still an extremely hard-fought series of years that the U.S. was involved in the Pacific theater. You can see this map is outlining the war movements in the Pacific theater from 1941, when the U.S. became involved, through 1945, when it ended. So you can see the Japanese Empire is in yellow here, and the lands that Japan had gained by 1942, so shortly after the U.S. entrance into the war, is in stripes. And there are battles that are marked here as well, and you're obviously welcome to come back and look at this if you're interested. But there are Japanese victories. They're more far flung, and the Allied victories move closer and closer to Japan. So there's talk that you'll hear of this Grand Alliance. So to outline a couple of basic things here that we've already been talking about, to be sure that you know what we're talking about precisely, the Axis powers consist of Japan, Italy, and Germany, led by Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler. The Allied forces are referring to the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And these were led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. So it becomes confusing for people because of the history to follow that the United States was allied with the Soviet Union and that FDR and Stalin were working together. They had a common enemy, essentially, at this point. It's not as if they magically, following the war, discovered all of these differences between each other on the cultural level. Those existed the whole time, but they had this common enemy in Hitler, and they were both interested in not allowing him to expand his empire. There were vicious battles all across Europe and Asia. We're not going to go over all these particular battles because you could do an entire course on that. You could do an entire semester just talking about World War II, either the European or the Pacific theater. So we're obviously just getting the basics here, and I encourage you to look into this further if you're interested. And one entertaining way to go about it would be to watch Band of Brothers. Well, it's not a documentary, it is more of a personal story, and there are real people who were interviewed. So it's a Hollywood version, but it's real people telling their stories and that being acted out on screen. So The Pacific and Band of Brothers, I would say if you're interested in this sort of thing, definitely watch those. One of the most famous military movements in U.S. history is D-Day. This took place June 6, 1944, and this was an attack in which the Allied forces invaded France via the Normandy beaches. And there were about 200,000 American, English, and Canadian soldiers who were under the command of General Eisenhower. And eventually there were 1 million soldiers who invaded through the beaches. And this made it the largest sea and land operation in history. By August 1944, Paris was liberated. So Paris had been taken in 1940, and nearing a year before the official end of World War II, Paris was liberated. Likely you've heard about the Holocaust throughout your education, but this is one of the more infamous programs that happened during World War II, and this was mainly focusing on the extermination of the Jewish people in Europe, as well as several other minority groups, including the Roma Sinti, who you may know commonly as gypsies. There was also persecution of homosexuals and people of Slavic backgrounds, as well as many others, but these are the larger groups of people. There were about 11 million people who were killed throughout the Holocaust, including 6 million Jews. And this was an extremely large portion of their population in Europe at the time. And many people were able to leave, but many had no way out or were stopped and taken into custody before they could find a way out. The system for killing people at this point was extremely advanced. It had the German government had set up camps in Germany and Poland. All of the death camps were in Poland, actually. And they also had these mobile killing squads called the Einsatzgruppen, and they had propaganda campaigns that were dealing with misinformation in Europe and abroad. And the Einsatzgruppen is credited with killing around 1 million people, and they were moving from Germany to the Soviet border. The eugenics movement had prompted a lot of what became the Holocaust, and the precursor to the camp system and to the mobile killing squads was this T4 program. And the T4 refers to the address that the main headquarters was located at. And this is prior to the final solution being implemented. And again, you could have entire courses on the Holocaust. So this is a very brief introduction, and I encourage you to pursue more information. But this T4 program that came prior to this camp system had similar elements to the American eugenics movement. We've talked about the eugenics before, and it's this rise of this scientific breeding and this determination of who is and who is not fit to reproduce and to exist. And in this case, in Germany, they were deciding who could and could not exist, and it was mostly physically and mentally disabled people who were euthanized throughout this program. They weren't just sterilized, they were euthanized in the German program. And the killing of Jews and of physically and mentally disabled people was printed in the US newspapers, and it was known about in this general way. It wasn't as if it was a complete secret and shock, but the extent of it was still really surprising to most people, especially those who were part of freeing the camps in 1945. On the home front, things were changing drastically as well. So there were about 10 million US males who were inducted into the armed forces throughout the war, and they were fighting in the places that we've been talking about. And about 50 million were actually required to register for the draft. But from 1942 forward, there was a draft-only policy. So they were no longer taking volunteers at that point, and it was a draft issue. Since Vietnam, it's been made up of volunteer only, and has largely excluded the middle or upper economic strata. So it's mostly been those at the bottom of the socioeconomic strata who have gone to war since Vietnam. And obviously there are exceptions to this, but by and large, that's how the statistics play out. And African Americans were drafted, but they were still required to serve in segregated units. In non-African American units, there was this newfound sense of mixed ethnicity. So some people hadn't been outside of their region and hadn't been outside of their hometowns in some cases, and were now being exposed to people of different ethnic backgrounds and learning different religious practices, different slang, different cultural understandings of what it meant to be an American. And as with the New Deal, there were increased numbers of federal agencies that were required to support the war effort. And the number of government employees grew from 1 million to 4 million. In 1940, there was a 14% unemployment rate, but by 1943, just 3 years later, it was down to 2%. And the gross national product jumped from $91 billion to $214 billion. So this is where you start to see the numbers that support the end of the Depression. The assembly line was in its heyday at this point, making vehicles and tanks for the war effort, as well as weaponry. The invention of improved technology to fight the war was also on a hot streak. So you had radar, jet engines, and really early computers coming into vogue at this point. The Western United States popped up as a newly found important hub for manufacturing. So it was no longer just up to the north or the middle of the country to provide the manufacturing labor. unions finally had an upper hand and forced businesses to acknowledge their demands in order to fully support the war. And you'll see this picture at the top left. This is Montgomery Ward, a giant department store. This is the president of Montgomery Ward being removed by the Army in 1944 for having defied pro-union orders. So the government was enforcing the rights of unions, and the Montgomery Ward president had denied some of these orders, and he was physically removed from his office. In 1945, union membership was at 15 million members. This was 1/3 of non-farm labor force. So this was extremely high by the end of the war. So when we talk about World War II, we'd talk about the facts, obviously, and we can also talk about how it stands in American memory at this point. This is oftentimes referred to as the Good War, and part of this is because pretty much everybody was in favor of the war. The country wasn't as divided as it had been in previous wars, and it's oftentimes referred to as a just war, in that if there was a war that was necessary, it was likely this one, and Hitler needed to be stopped, and that there was a real and present danger that needed to be conquered. So the war was advertised in this way during the war as well, as this good war, and using the word freedom to promote items. And this obsession with freedom ended up being added on to the 4 freedoms that we talked about. And this 5th freedom was said to be freedom to choose in a consumer setting. So the economy began booming, the consumer sector began booming, and this ability to choose the things that you wanted and have a comfortable life was one of the new freedoms that people were adding on to the 4 previous. The war is still remembered this way, as the good war, as the just war, and it also partly has to do with the fact that this was a decisive victory for the Allied forces, of which the U.S. was a part. There was a clear bad guy, and both in the European and the Pacific theater, they were defeated. And this just isn't the case for the wars that follow, with Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. There's no clear good end to the war. There's no clear end to the war, really. And it's not none of these are considered a win for the United States. So this is the last one where there's a clear win for the Allies in the United States. You have many women going to work at this point that we talked about before. Rosie the Riveter is likely the most memorable representation of women at work from this era. You've likely seen the cartoon, but the top left-hand drawing is also Rosie the Riveter. This is the original one. And there were many films from this era and stories from this era that portrayed women as independent and capable. And part of this is because women were entering the workforce, and so their independence seemed more inevitable and more laudable at this point. And they were encouraging women to become involved because men were missing. They were at war. There were also women at war. So by 1944, women made up 1/3 of the labor force in the United States, but there were also 350,000 women in auxiliary military units. So you see the poster on the top right here for the WAC, Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. And you can see the photo at the bottom here too. These are also women who were part of the WAC. And they were not in combat roles. As I'm sure you're aware, it's only recently that women have had combat roles open to them, but it doesn't mean that they didn't see combat. Many of the jobs that women held, either nursing or flying planes or working on planes, they were exposed to combat whether they were supposed to be or not. And that has been the case in every war. And they're simply not part of the combat units, and they're not trained as such, but it doesn't mean they didn't experience it. When the war ended, many women wanted to remain in the workforce, but for the most part, they were removed from the armed forces, and they were removed from the workforce in favor of returning these jobs to men. That's not the only hypocritical thing that happened, obviously, during the war. Americans were fighting against this Nazi racism, but had sent thousands of Japanese American citizens to internment camps. We'll talk about this coming up. And they lived with a Jim Crow system of segregation based on race in the South. So this is a major black eye that Hitler pointed out, that the Japanese Empire pointed out, and that eventually the Russians would point out throughout the Cold War. Racism and nativism eventually had their sort of scientific veneer that was held up by this pseudoscience removed in most places throughout the United States, but not in the South. Jim Crow remained intact, and one example of this is the infamous Tuskegee experiments, which were taking place before, during, and after World War II, with race science at its base. So the Tuskegee experiments, if you're unfamiliar, are syphilis experiments wherein African American men were infected already when they came for treatment, and they were lied to and not given treatment. And doctors over 4 decades were studying the effects of syphilis on black men because they believed that there would be differences between white and black men. And they were mostly studying syphilis and gonorrhea in order to stop American soldiers, from getting venereal diseases and bringing them back. So the United States was aware of the situation of Jews in Europe, and the United States didn't expand quotas for migrants and did not agree to bomb tracks leading up to camps in order to stop many of the operations of camp systems. Famously, they decided not to bomb the tracks that led to Auschwitz. And it's unclear if it would have made a big difference. Obviously, you could do what if history, but now we don't know. And this idea of hypocrisy had been pointed out before, obviously, Hitler began pointing it out, in the quest for the double victory that we've been talking about already. So this is acknowledging the fact that African Americans are fighting in these wars for the United States and then not being granted the full rights of citizenship. We can talk about Mexican Americans and Mexicans in the United States during the war. And Mexico and the United States established a program called the Bracero Program, meaning arms, in 1942 in order to provide contract labor for agricultural and domestic work. Many American men had gone to fight in the war effort, so they needed help farming, essentially. This program lasted until the 60s, and about 4.5 million people entered the United States through this program. Mexican American women on the West Coast had admired Rosie the Riveter and made their own Rosita the Riveter, and she was a popular figure the same way that Rosie had been for white working women. I've included a link for a video here about the Zoot Suit riots of 1943, and racism is at the base of this against young Latino men who were attacked. It's called Zoot Suit riot because they were wearing flamboyant suits called Zoot Suits, and sailors and policemen attacked Latino men, and there had been a surge of Latino immigrants due to the Bracero program, and it's one of the many race riots that we've talked about throughout American history. And you've likely heard a song. Maybe it's a generation above most of you, but there was a song called the Zoot Suit Riots, and I don't think most people knew that it was a real thing. So here it is. And please watch the video that I've included for you. Native Americans in World War II did join up in large numbers. Around 25,000 Native Americans served in the United States troops, and this includes the famous code talkers. They were speaking in Navajo language, and further than that, speaking in code within the Navajo language, and that was indecipherable to the Japanese. So they were able to give more secure communications that couldn't easily be hacked into. I've included a video here for you of an actual code talker being interviewed. The Iroquois did not recognize U.S. influence over them, and this is with regard to the draft and war in general, and the Iroquois declared war on the Axis themselves and joined the U.S. and other allies in the fight. Many Native American people left the reservations during this time where they had grown up, and many of them never returned. So there's sort of this diaspora following World War II where Native Americans had left these hubs of Native American community and moved out into the wider American community. Asian Americans in the war, this is ever more complicated, and around 50,000 Asian Americans fought in the war effort. By 1943, the U.S. had ended the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this is only technically, really. There was a quota limit of 105, so it didn't really open up immigration, even though China was allied against the Japanese. So Japanese citizens had a hard time in the United States at this point for reasons we will talk about in a few minutes, but also the U.S. was providing a lot of propaganda against the Japanese, and Japan was doing the same against the United States. So many people felt torn, much in the same way that people had felt torn in World War I, if they were German or Italian or Irish. Many people had conflicting feelings. About 70% of the Japanese people in the United States were living in California, many of them around the Los Angeles region and working in the farming industries. About 2/3 of the Asian population was actually born in the United States, making them U.S. citizens, because immigration had been cut off for so long. So there wasn't this new grouping of immigrants straight from Asia. They were people who had been born here to people who had previously immigrated. One of the complications of being a Japanese American person during World War II fell into place with the Executive Order 9066. So this was put through by FDR in 1942, stating that all Japanese people living in the United States, regardless of citizenship status, were to be removed from the West Coast. I'll show you a map on the next slide. but 110,000 men, women, and children, 2/3 of which were U.S. citizens, were moved to camps in the interior based on race alone. There were no court hearings, there was no due process, and there was no real protest from non-Japanese citizens about their removal. In 1944, there is a Supreme Court case, Korematsu v. USA. And the Supreme Court would not intervene when he did not report for internment. And it was a 6-3 majority and was never overturned. So this is open to still being used to say that it's protection of national security. So we saw this come up probably most recently. People started talking about this when they were talking about the travel ban on Muslims in the United States and Muslim Americans. Many of the Japanese Americans who were interned signed a loyalty oath, swearing allegiance, and actually enlisting in the war effort. 20,000 people from these internment camps joined the war effort. So they'd been taken by their country, moved away from their homes, and moved into internment camps surrounded by barbed wire and sometimes with little provisions. And still 20,000 joined the war effort to prove their loyalty to the United States. In 1988, Congress finally apologized for the Japanese internment and gave $20,000 to each of the survivors. This is now becoming a more talked about series of events. For many, many years, for many decades, this has sort of been glossed over. People didn't talk about it. People could talk about the Holocaust and the camp system there much more easily because it wasn't the U.S. history. It wasn't a dark mark on the U.S. But this most certainly is. But people are hoping now, I think, to have a more balanced idea of U.S. history, to understand why things are how they are, how they could be different, how they have been different, and just having an accurate view of the nation in order to have a more comprehensive patriotism, if you will. George Takei, you'll see a video of him describing his experience at one of these internment camps. He is famously Mr. Sulu on Star Trek, and he was in a camp as a child and has in recent years created a Broadway play called Allegiance about the experience. If you ever get a chance to see it, or if you get to see a filmed version of it, it's actually quite good and quite moving. So you can see on this map here, there's this movement from the military areas, so the entire West Coast, into the interior. And you can see the population at their peak is listed with blue circles representing the size, and the black dots represent internment camps. And you can see the assembly centers are within Military Area 1, and they're moved out and from there. You can see on the right here, you can see some of the alerts that all persons of Japanese ancestry needed to report to be moved to these camps. And the bottom picture, you can see the barracks that many of them were made to live in, and it was oftentimes in frigid conditions without enough provisions. African Americans in the war effort, we've talked a little bit about this already with the Nazis and their supporters pointing out the faults within the United States for maintaining Jim Crow. it goes further than this, in that the Red Cross at the time wouldn't even mix blood from white people and black people, relying on this faulty race science that was still popularized at the time. And we talked about the Great Migration during the Depression, moving northwards, and this happened again in the Second Great Migration, with 700,000 African American people moving out of the South and coming north to fill these industrial jobs that became available during the war. And African Americans also served in great numbers in the military, as we mentioned, and in mostly segregated units. And the segregated units were usually non-combat roles as well. There were cases where African American soldiers even had to vacate their seats on transports so that Nazi prisoners of war could sit down instead because they were white. The GI Bill did not apply evenly to African Americans because many universities and neighborhoods were segregated, and many banks wouldn't make loans for mortgages or farms to Black veterans either. There was international concern about colonized nations in Africa and the success of Black Americans as well. So they thought if there was this massive decolonization movement, that this would also speak to the capabilities of Black Americans, and to say that if these African countries were to gain their independence and create their own governments, then certainly the African American community should be a part of the American government. We talked about the double victory before, but to go over it again, it's a double victory over the Axis and over Jim Crow. You can see in this painting to the left, it says this is the enemy. So it's obviously mostly a Nazi, but if you look at the glass on his eye, you can see someone being lynched as well. So it's this win over the Nazi Empire and a win over Jim Crow at home. CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, was a pacifist group that had engaged in sit-ins during the war in order to attempt to integrate public spaces like restaurants and theaters. A. Philip Randolph was a labor leader, and in 1941, he planned this march on Washington to ask for access to defense employment and an end to segregation and a national anti-lynching law. In response to this proposed march, FDR processed Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in federal jobs in defense and established the Fair Employment Practices Commission to monitor this process. So there were some movements towards civil rights at home. The end of the war came in 1945. By March of 1945, U.S. troops had crossed the Rhine and moved into Germany. Hitler committed suicide at his bunker, where his top aides, as well as his wife, Eva Braun, were hiding. And Germany surrendered May 8th, 1945, and this is what it's called VE Day. It stands for Victory in Europe. The Pacific Theater, however, continued to rage on until August with the dropping of the atomic bombs and the eventual surrender of Japan. The Manhattan Project had used Einstein's theories in order to create an atomic bomb, and this had been approved in 1940 under FDR, but wasn't even tested until July of 1945 in the New Mexico desert under the Truman administration. FDR died in April of 1945 following a stroke. This meant that Truman would be the one to decide whether or not the atomic bomb should be used at all. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima, and the pilot dropped the first weaponized atomic bomb. 70,000 people died instantly, and by the end of that year, double that were dead following horrific radiation poisoning. 3 days after the Hiroshima bomb, there was a second bomb dropped on Nagasaki with the same results, 70,000 dead instantly. At the same time as these bombs were being dropped, the Soviets invaded Manchuria to fight the Japanese. Within a week, the Japanese surrendered. This remains extremely controversial for several reasons. One is that Japan seemed ready to surrender, and the United States was arguing that they required unconditional surrender instead of the surrender that the Japanese Empire was willing to offer. Another reason that this remains controversial is that this was targeting civilians. So the United States did not attempt to target military bases for this. It was civilian cities. There were somewhere around 75 million people who died during World War II, which included soldiers of both the Axis and the Allies, victims of the Holocaust, and about 20 million civilians. The Allied forces did indeed target civilians, not only with the atomic bombs, but also with fire bombings, most famously in Dresden and Tokyo, with about 100,000 dead in each city. We've seen this chart before, the total U.S. casualties by war, and you can see that World War II has the highest number of combat deaths, and only is only second in number of dead, and just barely, to the Civil War, which was all Americans fighting each other and had more non-combat deaths. So there were more deaths of Americans during the Civil War, but there were more combat deaths during World War II, and there were more wounded and missing in action as well. There was this need to reorganize the world, not only the nation, following World War II. The Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 divided Germany between the US, Russia, and England, and installed a military administration to run it. So they essentially took over with a military government. The Nuremberg trials were held in 1947 and put some of the major leaders of the Nazi movement on trial and actually convicted and executed some. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 in New Hampshire had established the World Bank and the IMF, which were both crucial to rebuilding Europe financially. The United Nations was the successor to the League of Nations and had a General Assembly providing an equal voice to member nations. So they had established a Security Council and vowed to maintain peace following the war. The hopes after the war was that the nation at large would have full employment, an expanded welfare state, and a high standard of living. There were attempts at socialization of education, healthcare, housing, and jobs through the Economic Bill of Rights in 1944, but the fear of communism was muddled in with socialism, and the fear of National Socialists or Nazis was ever present as well. So these things didn't necessarily pass at the time. FDR was a beloved figure by many, but there were also fears that so many administrations in a row could have turned into a dictatorship. So there needed to be some sort of reckoning with how many times someone could become president, and if they had set themselves up to potentially have a dictatorship, and that they needed to look out for this more in the future, having seen it happen to industrialized European nations as well. The GI Bill of Rights, formerly known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, was also put into place in 1944 in order to provide returning vets with scholarships, mortgage loans, pensions, and job training. As with most things, this applied only to specific people within the category of veteran, did not apply to women who served or non-whites. And this sort of sets up the next decade or two for this expansion of affluence that we will go